We found a distant galaxy that had a halo of gas outside that galaxy. But the bright stars in the galaxy illuminated that halo of gas sufficiently they were able to determine that halo of gas only has hydrogen and helium in it, which is exactly what the Big Bang predicted.
How recent was that discovery?
That discovery was made less than a year ago. I give a talk in public called, Cosmic Reasons to Believe, where I first say, here's the scientific evidence for deism, then here's the scientific evidence for theism, and here's the scientific evidence for a God intent on redeeming billions of human beings unto himself. So it basically guides the audience step by step towards the God of the Bible. And that's what Romans 1 tells us, that nature not only reveals the existence of God, but the attributes of God. So just showing how science actually reveals first there has to be a God to explain why there's a universe, and then the evidence this God must be a personal being, and then finally it must be the redeeming God of the Bible.
I thought a good place to start today's conversation could be, I actually think what we were just sharing before we kind of officially went live here would be great, where you described in your first, I don't know if it was your first book, but your book from 1989, The Fingerprint of God, where you said that it's an examination of scientific discoveries that reveal the identity of the Creator. And for some reason, that specific claim that these discoveries reveal the identity of the Creator really stood out to me. And I was curious if you would be willing to kind of unpack the sort of three-layered approach that you were describing before we started actually recording here, because I thought that was very fascinating.
Yeah, well, that book came out shortly after physicists had developed the first of the space-time theorems. And those theorems basically say if the universe contains mass and if general relativity reliably describes the movements of massive bodies in the universe, and both those assumptions are beyond doubt, then space and time must have a beginning. Space and time must be created, which implies there must be an agent outside of space and time that created our universe of space-time, matter, and energy. So that establishes deism, the idea that there is a causal creative agent that's responsible for bringing the universe into existence. And then that book goes into the fine-tuning argument. Then when we look at the features of the universe and the laws of physics, we see that they're very exquisitely fine-tuned or designed to make possible existence of life and human beings in particular. And the degree of fine-tuning we see in the universe and the laws of physics is many, many orders of magnitude beyond what we human beings are capable of achieving in our creativity and design. And we know that that level of fine-tuning design requires a causal agent that's intelligent, knowledgeable, creative, powerful, and those are attributes of a personal being. So establishes not just deism, but theism, the idea that a personal being is responsible for creating and designing the universe. And then we look deeper into these fine-tuning features and show that the fine-tuning evidence just to get life is one thing, but to get plants and animals, it's many, many orders of magnitude greater fine-tuning. And if you want the equivalent of human beings, again, is many, many orders of magnitude greater than what you need just to get plants and animals. But the greatest fine-tuning requirement is if you want a universe where you got the equivalent of human beings, where those human beings are able to be delivered from their sin and evil in the numbers over 1 billion. And that's where you get the greatest. And when we look at the universe, we see that indeed it is fine-tuned to make that possible happen. And that's what isolates the God of the Bible from the gods of the other religions of the world. So yeah, step by step, there has to be a God, there has to be a personal God, and step 3, it must be the redeeming personal God that we see described in the pages of the Holy Bible.
We've got to dig into that third one, because I think for myself, honestly, and I'm sure for some listening, they might need a little bit more unpacking to kind of cross that bridge from something that you could observe scientifically to the implication that its reason is for the redemption of a billion plus human beings.
Help us reach that million milestone. It also helps other people see this type of content in the future. I'll leave a link in the description where you can watch a documentary that I made. It's got Nabil Qureshi, Lee Strobel, William Lane Craig, and a bunch of other people in there that answer a lot of the questions that I've had about God over the years. I think you'll really like it, and it's totally free.
Yeah, well, I mean, we talked about my first full-length book, Fingerprinted God, in 1989. A book I wrote just a few years ago, Designed to the Core, basically looks at that third point in much more detail. And it's based on the fact that in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, the rare earth hypothesis is well established, that Earth is exquisitely fine-tuned to make possible the existence of life in humans in particular. What I did in Design to the Core is extend the rare earth doctrine to the rare sun doctrine, that you need a very specially designed star in order to have a planet orbiting it in which advanced life is possible, and how for 70 years astronomers have been scouring the universe to try to find a star sufficiently like the sun that it could be that kind of candidate. They found many stars that are twins of one another, but they've yet to find a star that sufficiently matches the characteristics of the sun to make that possible. And then I extend that to the rare galaxy hypothesis. There are 2 trillion galaxies in the universe. But as we look at those galaxies, we see that none of them have the characteristics for advanced life to be there. That's why I think we need to change all the Star Wars movies. It's not a galaxy far, far away. It's got to be our galaxy. We've looked at galaxies far, far away. None of them are candidates. Then we extend that to the rare galaxy cluster doctrine and the rare cluster of cluster galaxies doctrine, the rare cosmic web doctrine, basically making the point, whatever size scale you look at in the universe, from the universe as a whole, all the way down to the fundamental particles that make up atoms and molecules, we see that it has been fine-tuned. It has been designed not just to make life possible, but to make the redemption of billions of human beings within a relatively short period of time from their sin and evil to be a possibility. And lately what I've been doing with my secular peers, say, look, I know you're not yet a follower of Jesus Christ, but if you will do your scientific research from a biblical redemptive perspective, it will make you more successful in making scientific discoveries. Put it to the test, see what happens.
So can you give an example of that? Because I do understand how a secular thinking person could sort of stand there with their jaw on the floor once you sort of bring in teleology and say, these physical things are happening for this reason. And maybe if someone were to kind of push back and say, well, how do you know? How do you know the reason that, like, how do you get from just these observations to the theological point that you're making?
Well, for example, if you want to have billions of beings like us who are spiritual and in needing to be delivered from their sin and evil existing on one planet, that planet has to have the design features that would permit the existence of a billion plus individuals like us on that planet. And if you want those individuals to be able to communicate the gospel message of how the creator of the universe is offering to humanity to do for them what he can't do for them, what they can't do for themselves, they're going to need a basic level of technology to make that communication possible. So now you say, okay, what kind of universe do we need where we can have high-tech technology existing on a single planet where a billion of those individuals could exist at one time? And I think it's fairly straightforward to recognize that demands a lot more fine-tuning than just having a place where bacteria exists for a few weeks at a time. And then does that actually pervade through the whole size scale of the universe? I mean, I could argue if all you want is a few microbes existing for a few weeks on a planet, you don't really have to sweat the cosmic web. You don't have to sweat what the kind of galaxy cluster you live in, cluster of galaxies. But if you want humans to be redeemed in large numbers who are spiritual and needing that redemption, yes, then indeed, the whole thing needs to be fine-tuned at every possible size scale level. If there's a creator that's designing everything to make our existence possible and the purposes for which he created us possible, then fine-tuning discoveries should lead to additional fine-tuning discoveries. I'll give you an example. Astronomers have known for some time if you want life on a planet, you have to have liquid water. And so NASA coined the term the liquid water habitable zone. Basically, if a planet's going to be habitable, it has to be orbiting its host star at a distance where liquid water could conceivably exist on the surface of the planet. And I accept all that, but recognizing if there really is the creator God of the Bible behind this, there shouldn't be just one habitable zone, but multiple habitable zones. Let's do the research and see if that's actually true. Well, the first one that was discovered using that principle was the ultraviolet habitable zone. How if you want life on a planet, you can't have such intense short wavelength ultraviolet radiation that radiation snuffs out the existence of all life on the planet. On the other hand, there's certain life-critical biochemical reactions that require some level of long wavelength ultraviolet radiation. So you have to fine-tune the ultraviolet radiation that's impacting the planet. Here's the problem. For the vast majority of planetary systems, the ultraviolet habitable zone does not overlap the liquid water habitable zone. And so, NASA was making the point, maybe there's 40 billion habitable planets in our Milky Way galaxy alone. But if you say, well, for life to exist, it has to simultaneously reside in the ultraviolet habitable zone and the liquid water habitable zone. Suddenly that 40 billion number drops down to a few hundred million. And now there are 12 other known habitable zones. And so you say, well, of the 7,500 planets we've discovered outside the solar system, how many of them exist in 3 of those 14 habitable zones? The answer is just one. And it's the same one that exists in all 14. And you get one guess as to which planet that is.
That is really interesting. Now, would a secular scientist, how would they go about explaining that? Or what's the alternative to someone wanted us to be here?
Well, they would say it's just by pure chance. I mean, we just happen to have the physics play out in a lucky way that we can exist here. Some have appealed to the multiverse, saying, what if there's an infinite number of universes? In fact, when I wrote The Fingerprint of God in 1989, I was already telling audiences, the evidence for fine-tuning that implies a God of the Bible is exponentially increasing. The evidence literally gets stronger with every month that goes by. Eventually, the evidence will be so potent that atheists will have nowhere else to go but to hypothesize there's an infinite number of universes that are all different from one another, and we happen to live in the one lucky universe where everything is just right. And by year 2000, that's exactly what happened. Atheists were saying there's a multiverse, infinite number of universes. But I find it interesting that an agnostic astrophysicist, Leonard Susskind, has basically told his peers, we've got to stop using the multiverse. It explains everything. An argument that explains everything explains nothing. And what I've done in The Creator and the Cosmos, the 4th edition, is to give you an example of that. And the whole point is lay people need to understand, infinity times infinity equals infinity. Infinity to the infinity power equals infinity. So if you're going to appeal to a multiverse, that would mean you could have an infinite number of planets, just like planet Earth. And on those infinite number of planet Earths, you could have an infinite variety of birch tree species. And what do birch trees do? They peel thin white pieces of bark. Well, if you've got an infinite variety of birch tree species, one of those species will peel thin white pieces of bark that are perfectly rectangular and measure 8.5 by 11 inches. And these pieces of birch bark will fall on soils with random chemicals in them that will make imprints on these pieces of birch bark that will duplicate all the photographs, tables, equations, and paragraphs in every scientific research paper that's ever been written. So those millions of scientific research papers, it's not scientists that wrote them, the multiverse did it. So that's an example of how you fall into a philosophical refutable trap if you appeal to a multiverse. The best argument is a personal being actually designed it so we could live and thrive here.
What's interesting is as you go from the extremely broad, cosmic scale that we're talking about now down into something as minute as the origin of life on planet Earth, it seems that you find a similar level of precision and detail and fine-tuning. I don't know if that's quite the right word or what you would say about that, but I want to lead into, I know you wrote a book with Fuzz Rana on that was called Origins of Life. And I'm curious, my understanding of this book is that it compares biblical and evolutionary models. And I'm really curious to kind of allow you to kind of compare and contrast these two, because I've done a number of videos on this channel, and anytime that there's a lot of confusion is the point. Anytime that I will talk about abiogenesis, I'll be quickly reminded that that's not the same thing as evolution, which is true to a certain extent, but then there's the whole chemical evolutionary process, and the point will inevitably or seemingly inevitably be missed that when it comes to a narrative explanation of how we are here today, there really are two different stories or narratives or explanations for how we are here today. And so I just kind of wanted to give you that lead in to sort of walk us through what our options are and where you think the evidence is pointing.
Now, that's a great lead in. I mean, 40 years ago, I founded Reasons to Believe on the principle of a testable, falsifiable, predictive biblical creation model. And what we've done throughout those 40 years is say, let's take our biblical creation model, compare it with competing models, and see how well it fares as scientific discoveries are being made. So when Origins of Life, number one, we attended several Origin of Life research conferences. So we were there to actually hear about the emerging discoveries, went through the scientific literature. And what we did in that book is to compare our Origin of Life model from a biblical perspective with the Origin of Life model from a non-theistic perspective, and ask the question, in light of emerging scientific discoveries, how well is our model doing relative to the non-theistic Origin of Life research models? And the thing we observed in attending these research conferences, there were typically 300 or 400 Origin of Life researchers that would meet for several days to discuss their research work. We noticed that each meeting was more depressing than the previous meeting, because as they were making these discoveries, they were just finding out, hey, we're in more trouble trying to come up with a naturalistic explanation than we were the last time we met. And that's been going on now for several decades. And so we've been engaging Origin of Life researchers saying, well, if you look at the origin of life from a biblical perspective, you see the opposite. Emerging scientific discoveries are increasingly giving support for that creation model. And that's how science is supposed to work. You have competing models. Let's see which model fares better in light of emerging scientific discoveries. And so, and what was really interesting is that one of those Origin of Life research conferences, a scientist came to the discussion microphone and said, okay, we're at the end of our week together. And what we did during the first day, we eliminated Earth as a possible site for the origin of life, again, from a non-theistic perspective. And then the second day, we eliminated Mars. And then the third day, we eliminated all other solar system bodies. And then the fourth day, we eliminated another planetary system, bringing life here to planet Earth. He says the only thing remaining is that there must have been aliens from a distant planetary system that traveled here in spaceships and put life here on planet Earth, and they must have come back several times to explain the Avalon explosion, the Cambrian explosion, and eventually introduction of human beings, because there's multiple places where we need intelligent input. And I remember Fuzz and I, we were sitting in the second row and said, this man, he's getting close to the right answer. It really is an intelligent alien, but not from another planetary system. And one of the organizers of the conference was right in front of us, and he turned around and says, I know exactly what you guys are talking about. So
that is really
also
funny.
gave us an opportunity to engage these scientists. And, the last Origin of Life research conference we attended, Fuzz and I basically approached these researchers and say, you all call yourself atheists, but really you're default atheists. You've never really thought about the issue. You've never really thought about the fact that you're going to die and what's going to happen to you after you die. Does the universe have a purpose? And they admitted, no, we've not thought about any of those things. So,
can you unpack some of the specifics that were being described that led that presenter to say that there needed to be an alien from a galaxy far, far, far away to make that interjection into the science that we're looking at?
Well, for example, it all goes back to that high school thing about, the flask of Stanley Miller, where they put certain chemicals inside a flask, put a spark through it, and they got some amino acids. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. So they're saying, hey, maybe we get all the amino acids we need. Well, that Miller experiment was done decades ago. What we've now discovered is, yes, we have found 10 of those 20 bioactive amino acids and in meteorites, in asteroids, but we find them at very low abundance levels. And moreover, what we're finding is predominantly the simplest ones. Glycine, for example, made up 98% of the amino acids that Stanley Miller found. And we can't find the complex ones, not been found anywhere. And moreover, we're finding the more complex ones that we have found at parts per billion, parts per trillion. And that abundance level is way too low to sustain a naturalistic origin of life. So the fact that some of the building blocks are missing is a big problem. The other big problem is you can take the known bioactive amino acids, just take them from different organisms, then try to put them together. And they performed some amazing laboratory experiments where they're able to put up to 40 of these amino acids together to make, a short protein. Well, you can't really call it a protein because it's just only 40 components. But what they discover is if you try to go above 40, you can't pull the amino acids off the glazed substrate that's necessary to get them together. And to have life, you need proteins with 10,000 plus amino acids in them. So there's that barrier that they're discovering. But there's articles been published in the scientific literature saying, we Origin of Life researchers, we've done some amazing things in the lab. But notice, it takes a lot of technology, a lot of funding, and very brilliant and knowledgeable biochemists to get these extremely limited results that really don't get us very far in solving the origin of life problem. And so one of them, an atheist, made the point, we're committing the God dilemma. In other words, we're basically taking the place of God. An intelligent agent is working here under highly sophisticated conditions, making sure we're only looking at constructive chemical pathways, not destructive ones. We're committing the hand of God dilemma. And he actually wrote in the British journal Nature, we Origin of Life research chemists need to tell people in our research papers how many times we commit the hand of God dilemma to get the limited results we do. I've read those papers. It's always over 12 times. So it's like
Wow.
Someone much more intelligent, better funded, with better technology than our best biochemists must be responsible for the origin of life.
Yeah, I think that that's super interesting for a number of reasons. One is that apparently an intelligent agent playing a role in the process of the formation of life is a legal move when it's a scientist, but is an illegal move if it's a different intelligent agent doing it. I just find that to be in and of itself interesting, and it kind of ties into the panspermia that you were talking about a second ago, where if it's aliens bringing life to this planet at different points, then that's a legal move. That's scientific. That's okay. But intelligent design as a hypothesis is, I'm told, according to Wikipedia, a pseudo-scientific theory. And I just find that to be really interesting, where it's like there's this one sort of like illegal move which is appealing to the ultimate intelligent agent, but any other intelligent agent involvement in the formation of life is considered acceptable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And, I would expect that bias. I mean, we're told in the Bible that we're born in rebellion against our Creator. And therefore, it would be typical that you would say anything but that option. And so they're looking at the anything but. But as the evidence accumulates, it basically forces you to retreat to a smaller and smaller speculative space. I mean, I even see that in the space-time theorems, where physicists have been saying, well, these theorems hold all the way back to 10 to the minus 43 seconds after the cosmic creation event. Perhaps they don't hold earlier than that. But now we have astronomical observations where we see the energy level at 10 to the minus 43 seconds. In fact, we've exceeded that by a factor of 8 times. It tells us that the atheistic attempts to get around the space-time theorems do not work. So what's happened? They've been retreating. Now, I would argue as a scientist, in order to defend your hypothesis, if you're on continual retreat as scientific discoveries are being made, that's a strong indication you got the wrong model. On the other hand, if future scientific discoveries are making a stronger case for your hypothesis, that's a suggestion you're on the right track to truth. And that's how I'm arguing science should work. But I think we also need to acknowledge the biases are real, but they need to be acknowledged.
It reminds me of the old search for the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and the closer that you get to the rainbow, it seems to keep recessing and equidistant into the foreground in front of you. Which, yeah, I think your point is a good one there. Maybe you're going in the wrong direction. Maybe you need to reconsider the a priori there. So that's super interesting. I feel like a lot of what is, and maybe this is an obvious observation, but a lot of what is at play here seems to just be, speaking of a priori, like the more worldview basis that informs the critical analysis of the data. And I think in a lot of people's mind, like there just isn't anything other than matter as a brute fact, and so you can't even consider that type of a thing because the second you've done so, you've left rationality, logic, science, etc.
Well, there are journals that we're now publishing in that don't take that narrow of a perspective.
Okay.
And what I love about those journals, they say, okay, your reviewers can be anonymous, but their critique of your paper has to be public. And they actually give us the privilege of responding to the criticisms and allow for as much as 3 back and forths to go by. I mean, one paper I submitted, the reviewers were atheist astrophysicists. They want the paper to be rejected because I made too strong of a link between the science and the God of the Bible. But they had to make public their criticism. I responded to their criticism. And eventually they said, okay, we're going to let this paper be published. But you can read the paper free online. You can read the critiques online. I love that because you actually get to see an exchange between Christian research scientists and those who are not, and just see how that dialogue works out. And so we're busy at Reasons to Believe publishing additional journal articles like that. So not all journals say you can't talk about God. Some of them actually allow you to do that.
What was the name of that article?
It was called Black Holes as Evidence for God's Care. You can put that into a search engine or just put Black Holes Hugh Ross. It'll probably pop up, and you can read the article. What was really fun is to read the exchange between me and the reviewers. And it's all available for free.
To help tease that a little bit more, do you mind sharing kind of what the hypothesis was of that article, or kind of just a brief sort of a teaser trailer overview?
Well, I was arguing that black holes indeed are dangerous. They pour up very deadly radiation. But we happen to be living in a galaxy that has a quiescent black hole at its core that's 40 times smaller than what you'd expect for a galaxy our size. So I was basically suggesting it's been designed that way to make advanced life possible within the galaxies. Likewise, the black holes and the surrounding galaxies around us. They're all smaller than they should be and a lot more quiet than they should be. But also argued that we need black holes. About a quarter of the elements in the periodic table are only manufactured when neutron stars that are orbiting one another, their orbit collapses and they merge and they become a black hole. At the point where the two neutron stars merge together to become a black hole, you get the very efficient production of what are called rapid process elements. And that's about a quarter of the elements in the periodic table, including 3 elements that I list as vital poisons. Too much in your body will kill you. Too little in your body will also kill you. Basically making the point that the distribution of black holes and the rate at which they're being produced in our Milky Way galaxy must be fine-tuned to make the existence of life and human beings possible here on planet Earth. So last time I checked, there was about 22,000 views of that article, which is a very large number for a peer-reviewed scientific article.
That is super interesting. I will definitely get that link and put it in the description for those who are interested to go down that rabbit hole, because that sounds really fascinating. Can I pivot here to, in much more recently now, in 2023, your book, Rescuing Inerrancy, a Scientific Defense, dealing with the topic of, it's really curious, like a scientific defense of inerrancy. Again, that's another one of those titles that you're good at writing titles to books because it raises curiosity. So what is that book about?
Well, it's in response. I teach at 3 different seminaries, and it's a response to what I've observed that seminary researchers and professors are abandoning the doctrine of biblical inerrancy. That's the doctrine that everything in the Bible is correct and accurate in what it conveys, not just for faith and practice and doctrine, but also for science, geography, and history. And what I was discovering is that these theologians were abandoning that doctrine because they said science forces us to abandon it. And I said, well, look, I'm a scientist. I've been looking at the science you think threatens biblical inerrancy. I don't see such a threat. Moreover, I think you haven't used the biblical testing method, which we scientists call the scientific method, in analyzing the Bible's creation text. And so, taking that interpretive approach in the Bible's creation text, actually looking at the latest science, we see that science is making it much easier to defend biblical inerrancy than it did, say, 100 years ago, which is the opposite of what these theologians are claiming. They're claiming that the new science is for the first time forcing us to abandon this archaic doctrine of biblical inerrancy. I'm arguing it's the opposite. It's making biblical inerrancy much more defensible than it was even 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
Where are some of those battle lines drawn? What are some of the key texts or verses that are in dispute within that whole conversation? Because that's quite interesting.
Well, probably the area where we've seen the greatest, quote, abandonment of that doctrine is what the Bible says about human origins. How the Bible says that God created Adam and Eve, and that all human beings are descended from that one couple that God specially created. A number of theologians have been listening to certain anthropologists and geneticists and saying that's no longer defensible. We must be descended from a large population, 10,000 plus individuals, not just two. And so I have a chapter in that book, chapter 19, where I look at the latest genetic evidence, the latest evidence from physical anthropology saying, actually, the biblical doctrine is even more defensible than it was. And basically showing that, yes, what we see, I've been following the genetic argument. 50 years ago, they were saying, well, from a naturalistic perspective, we have to be descended from 1 million individuals. Then the number dropped to 100,000. Francis Collins in his book said 10,000. Fuzz Rana, my colleague, when he debated Dennis Venema, Dennis said 1,200. Then I heard the number 800. When I debated the president of BioLogos, she said we could go as low as 130. And I'm saying, let's plot a graph. It seems like we're heading down towards the biblical two. Moreover, what we now recognize is that you can't use the genetic diversity of a mammalian species to determine the ancestral population. And they've done field studies on this, where they'll put, say, a pair of sheep on an island where no mammals exist at all. They look at their genetics, and then they come back many years later and look at the genetics of, say, 10 generations of offspring. And what they discover, you get way more genetic diversity from those two sheep than you'd expect from any of the mathematical genetics models, which tells me those models are mathematically too simple. And genetics is a complicated discipline. I'm not surprised by that. But what they have discovered is you get the greatest departure where you have a mammal species with a long generation time, meaning a long time between being born and being able to reproduce. Well, guess what? We human beings have the longest, or near the longest, generation time. And therefore, we would expect the greatest departure. Bottom line, there isn't a genetic challenge to all of us being descended from Adam and Eve, with one proviso. We can't put Adam and Eve as recent as 6,000 years ago. In fact, I would argue, based on what we see in Genesis 2, with these 4 rivers coming together in the Garden of Eden, that can only happen when sea levels are about 200 feet lower than they are today, which implies that the Garden of Eden event happened during an ice age. So it's not 6,000 or 10,000 years ago. It's probably in the neighborhood of 50,000 to 150,000 years ago, which is right in line with even the naturalistic genetic models of how far back in time you have to go to get us descended from one man and one woman. So that's one example.
Now, for a person who hears that and that makes sense to them, but they have read the first few chapters of Genesis and they remember it describing a different timeline, a different series of events, can you kind of help walk through your interpretation of how you would reconcile these two or sort of realms, the sort of the scientific genetic realm that you're talking about,
Right.
and then the description given in the Bible?
Well, a lot of theologians are saying we can no longer scientifically defend the creation accounts of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. My response is, well, you can't if you use your interpretive approach. But if we use the biblical testing method, aka the scientific method, it can be done. So, step 1 of the scientific method, don't interpret until you first establish the frame of reference or the point of view. Well, in Genesis 1:1, that reference frame is a universe. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The heavens and the earth is an ancient Hebrew idiom that refers to the entire universe. They didn't have a word for universe. They used that phrase instead. But when you go to Genesis 1:2, the frame of reference has changed from the universe to the surface of the earth. The Spirit of God is hovering over the surface of the waters of planet Earth. Now, step 2 of that scientific method, don't interpret until you also establish the starting conditions. Well, Genesis 1:2 states that for us. the Spirit of God was hovering on the surface of the waters of planet Earth, and it was dark on the surface of the waters, and the water covered the whole surface of the earth, and the earth was empty of life and unfit for life. And you get a good parallel in Job 38, where it explains why it was dark on the surface of the waters, how God had blanketed the earth with clouds that kept the seas dark. And we know that the primordial earth had an atmosphere 200 times thicker than it has today. That atmosphere would not let any visible light get through to the surface of the earth. But creation day 1, it says, let there be light. And we now know there was a collision event between the early earth and a fifth rocky planet, Theia, and that collision event stripped almost all the water and atmosphere from the primordial earth. That now allowed light to get through to the surface of the waters. And you can go step by step through creation day 2. That's about the water cycle. Day 3, continents appear for the first time. And we know that that collision event between those two rocky planets, it gave Earth powerful plate tectonics, and those tectonics would have made the continents. You would have had life proliferating in the continents. Then the atmosphere goes transparent on the 4th day. We know why, because the life that God created pumped oxygen in the atmosphere, and that cleared out the haze and allowed animals on the surface of the earth to actually see the sun, moon, and stars in the sky. Bottom line, following that biblical testing method, you see that Genesis 1's description of the creation events, everything is in the correct chronological order, and everything is correctly described with respect to the well-established scientific record. Then you get into Genesis 2. And what I've been noticing, these theologians see that as a recasting. I don't see it that way. I look at Genesis 1 as focusing on the physical aspects of creation. Genesis 2 focuses on the spiritual aspects.
I love what you said. That if you were to plot it on a chart, you see us getting closer to 2. So I think that that's really interesting. And I want to understand your view, though. Are those two made ex nihilo, or do you see them as, you're nodding your head, so yes, Adam and Eve were made ex nihilo?
Yes, and what you see in Genesis 1 is it uses two verbs to describe God bringing into existence human beings. He made them and he created them, asa and bara. The verb asa, manufacture, means that God personally took the dust of the earth and made the physical bodies of Adam and Eve. But it also used the words bara, which means to create something brand new that did not exist before. And he breathed into them his spirit. And so we humans became not just a physical body, not just a body with mind, will, and emotions that we share with birds and mammals that the Genesis 1 talks about on creation day 5, is that he made us spirit beings, which means that we're able to communicate with the Creator himself. Notice that the birds and mammals, they're designed to communicate to a higher species, namely us human beings. God designed us likewise so we could communicate to a higher being, namely God himself, but we're the only species on earth that has that capacity. And even from an atheistic perspective, notice that humans are the only species that has ever existed on earth that asks the question, is there a God? Can I relate to that God? Is there meaning beyond my life here on earth? I mean, I've got a very intelligent dog. That dog never addresses those philosophical issues.
Yeah, exactly. I love, I think it's G.K. Chesterton who noted that we would never read a 12-part series on cow pastures and cow behaviors because there's no story. They just eat grass, procreate, walk around. There's no will, there's no overcoming, there's no questioning, there's no story. It's just cows on a plot of land, which is, I think...
You don't see a bunch of cows gathering together around their food tray and discussing philosophy.
Exactly. Now, when you, because I haven't done too deep of a dive into it, but I'm aware that there are other people talking about different types of hominids and sort of like different types of humans before humans and this whole thing. And I think even William Lane Craig kind of went down this path a little bit.
Right.
What do you have to say, or what's your perspective on all of that? If you have, I guess in my mind, I'm just trying to flesh it out, at least understand what we're talking about. So you're saying dirt and wet spit and the Spirit of God, ex nihilo, Adam and Eve are created. And what would, I guess two questions as I'm gathering my thoughts. One, can you help me understand how, before that happened, what happened? I guess in terms of people talking about these 100,000-year-old people and these hominids and these, all of these sort of evolutionary thing, part ape, part human things. Like, what do you make of all of that?
Well, the naturalists will say that there were these apes that had large body size, and they naturally evolved and produced as human beings. And so if you look at the fossil record, you'll see about 10 or 12 different species of bipedal primates that preceded us human beings. And the non-theists will argue there's been a natural progression from the most primitive one 6.5 million years ago to us human beings today. Fazal Rana and I have responded to that in the book, Who is Adam? And I gave an update in my book, Rescuing Inerrancy, where we actually look at what the scientific evidence tells us. And what we noticed is we don't see a linear progression in brain size and brain capability over those 6.5 million years. It actually goes up and down like this. Same thing with the bipedal capability. It goes up and down with respect to time. There's not this linear progression that you would have to have in place if indeed this is strictly naturalistic. So, for example, the very latest bipedal primate we have found is a 3-foot-tall individual that lived in Indonesia. The brain size is that of a chimpanzee, 4 times smaller than that of a human brain or a Neanderthal brain. And again, the bipedal capability isn't there as what you see with Neanderthals and humans. But people lately, including Bill Craig, have made a strong case that Neanderthals and humans are part of the same species, that Adam must have given rise to both of them, and maybe Homo erectus as well, which is why we had reasons to believe have actually looked in detail at the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, Homo erectus, and say, can we really see that there's this link that would suggest they're all naturally descended from one man and one woman? And we argue that the science definitively established that can't be the case. So yes, it is true that the Neanderthal brain weighs about as much as our brain, but it's having to manage a much heavier body. And so what's really crucial is the ratio of the brain mass to the body mass. And that's where we humans are ahead. Where we're really ahead is our brains have a very different structure. The Neanderthal brain kind of looks like a cylindrical Coke can. Ours kind of looks like a basketball, so the shape is different. We have these large frontal lobes, which allows us to engage in philosophy and theology and mathematics. And that's not the case for Neanderthal. And the density of neurons in our brain is much greater than the density of neurons in the Neanderthal brain. That's what really counts. How many neurons you have in your brain, not how massive your brain is. And when you look at the DNA, we see that, yes, there's a lot of similarity between human DNA and Neanderthal DNA, but where you see the greatest differences is in that part of the genome that governs neurology and brain function. That's where you see a huge difference, and that's what really separates us from the Neanderthals. But the one place where we have seen a linear progression is a capacity of these bipedal primates that preceded us to hunt big game, especially large-bodied birds and mammals. And what we notice is that each successive species is a little more able to do that. Neanderthals' diet was almost exclusively based on the meat from large-bodied birds and mammals. And we argue that God knew ahead of time that we human beings would rebel against him. And in our sin, we would basically not wisely manage the planet, and we would begin consuming these large-bodied bird and mammals. For example, it's well established that we are responsible for wiping out the woolly mammoth. I mean, as humans crossed over the land bridge from Asia and North America, they found these big elephant-sized creatures. They didn't move fast, they're easy to kill, and hey, one mammoth feeds 4,500 people. So it's an easy source of food. And I think God knew ahead of time we were in danger of wiping out the very animals we needed to launch and sustain civilization. And what we notice is that North America, South America, and Australia, we don't find any evidence for bipedal primate species that preceded us. And it's on those continents, when humans came in, where they basically wiped out these large-bodied bird and mammal species. So, for example, humans, when they came into Australia, quickly wiped out 94.5% of all the large-bodied bird and mammal species that existed there. Consequently, the Aborigines were stuck at a low population, Stone Age technology until Europeans came and brought the animals that they needed. To a lesser degree, that also happened in North and South America, with extinction rates of 73 and 78%. Africa, which had almost all these 10 or 12 species, the extinction rate was only 4.5%. So it's like, okay, God basically created these different species. I think they're all specially created. I don't think they evolved. They're specially created, but they were designed by God basically to train these bird and mammal species. When you see tall bipedals with weapons in their hands, run away from them. Don't run towards them. And hence we see that they survived in Africa, Europe, and Asia. They did not survive in North and South America and Australia.
So this is really interesting to me, and I think I'm realizing I might have misunderstood your view on some of this, which is actually good. This is good to learn in real time. So you would definitely disagree, or I guess let me rephrase that. Would you disagree with the sort of common, like, descent from a common ancestor idea?
Yes, I would.
Okay, so can you just walk me through
design. Yeah, common design, not common descent.
Okay, can you walk me through that? Just imagine that I don't know anything about your view, even though there are certain pieces that I have in my mind, but I'm realizing I think I've gotten some of them wrong. And I think it's so funny within Christian circles, there's all these like battle lines are drawn around all this kind of stuff. And so I want to make sure that I don't misunderstand or misrepresent your actual view of how these different pieces fit together, where there is some type of evolution going on, but there's not a common ancestor. I don't know. Can you just kind of walk me through it?
Yeah, and reasons to believe we do accept that microevolutionary things are happening. After all, I mean, we're quite a bit taller than humans were at the time of the Roman Empire. Our eyesight is better, and natural selection is responsible for our superior eyesight and our larger body size. That's microevolution. But notice, we're still the same species that Adam and Eve and his children were part of. We're not in any way substantially different from them. Our mental capabilities, for example, would be the same. However, we would deny macroevolution. And for example, one reason I find it very difficult to accept the doctrine of the common descent of these primates that evolved into the bipedal primates and on into human beings is that the population levels are too low and the generation times are too long for a naturalistic model to explain how this could possibly happen. We now know, for example, that the maximum number of Neanderthals that existed at one time was below 15,000 individuals, maybe even below 5,000 individuals. 8,000 is a number that's bandied around. And the area in which they inhabited was several million square miles. So the density is like, one Neanderthal for every 1,000 square miles. And so with that kind of low population and low opportunity to engage other individuals, these naturalistic evolutionary mechanisms aren't going to do anything for you, which is why I argue the Neanderthals have to be supernaturally created, just like we human beings are supernaturally created. So, where did you want to go from there?
Well, I guess, no, that's helpful. I guess my question is, well, let me ask this question. Beyond the reason that you just gave, what else could you share with someone who has, just kind of gone up through public school system and basically just accepts macroevolution as a totally case closed fact rather than, the theory of evolution? Like, this is presented as an absolute fact. And so why do you disagree with that?
Yeah, where the debate's gone today is on the behavior of the Neanderthals relative to the behavior of human beings. So they'll argue, for example, there are scientific papers that say that the Neanderthals were able to use fire. The bigger question, though, is did they control fire, or did they just opportunistically take advantage of fire? So, for example, there are field studies showing that chimpanzees will opportunistically take advantage of wildfires. For example, they will collect up these nuts and throw the nuts on a wildfire, run away from the wildfire, and afterwards come back and they're able to crack open those roasted nuts. And so we're arguing that's what Neanderthals were doing. They didn't have control over fire where they're able to build a hearth and cook their food. We noticed that their diet was different from humans. The earliest humans were basically gathering otherwise poisonous vegetables, processing them and cooking them so they'd be safe to eat. We have no evidence that Neanderthals were doing that. And where we do see them associated with fire, it's in the summertime, not the wintertime. If they really had control over fire, we would find much stronger evidence for the correspondence between fire and Neanderthals in the wintertime than we do the summertime. And likewise, there's a famous paper that Bill Craig cites in his book where he says, hey, there's this paper saying that Neanderthals were involved in using different kinds of strands and making fabrics and weaving things and engaging complex. Well, that one paper is talking about a knot that's only 1 millimeter in diameter, and the strands of fabric or cellulose are 6 millimeters long. And I'm arguing what you see there is no more sophisticated than what you see birds use in building a nest. But people have argued this is proof that they had high mathematical capability. And moreover, having been raised in coastal British Columbia, I've seen knots like that on trees. I mean, so just the different fibers off of trees under wet conditions will, by natural process, turn themselves into a knot like that. I see no evidence that Neanderthals were using this to make ropes or able to make clothing. We have no evidence that they had needles. The earliest humans actually had sophisticated needles. So yeah, we got a good, strong case that the humans were doing that, but we have no evidence that Neanderthals are capable of doing that. And they didn't have the brain structure to be able to engage in that kind of sophisticated behavior. But that's a big part of the debate. And the whole point is, yes, you'll see these papers making claims that they were doing religious practices involved in art. But if you look at the entirety of the scientific literature, for every paper published like that, there are dozens of papers that refute the claim. And so I've been talking to lay people saying, whenever you see something like this in the scientific literature, look at the other papers that also deal with the same subject matter. If you've got 20 papers refuting it and only one paper claiming it, then don't hang your hat on that one paper.
That is helpful, because I remember a couple of months ago looking into what is called Neanderthal art. I don't know if you've seen this or not.
Oh, yes.
Is that another example of some lines being blurred, or what's the explanation for that artwork?
Well, I mean, probably an even more famous example is they're claiming that Neanderthals had developed an alphabet and a writing system because they found on a cave that had been occupied by Neanderthals some marks, some linear marks going down. And they said, oh, that must have been the letter of an alphabet. And I'm saying, well, maybe it's just some scratch marks on the wall. And hey, I've seen bears make different kinds of things that look less complex than what they were claiming in that paper. And, who else occupied that cave? And what's interesting is that some of these claims for Neanderthal art, they're caves that are occupied by bears, Neanderthals, and humans. So who's really responsible for that? And do you actually see a level of sophistication? A few vertical marks with a cross mark through it, that could be just something that's completely accidental or even produced by a non-primate at all. But if you actually see a depiction of an animal with coloration, which is what you see in the Spanish and French cave arts, that clearly requires some creativity. And we don't see that kind of evidence for Neanderthals or Denisovans. We do see it for anatomically modern humans. And that's the whole point, is that we see not just a slight difference, it's an enormous chasm in the capability of what you see with anatomically modern humans and what you see in these bipedal primates. The naturalist has to argue that there's a graduation, very gradual development. We don't see that. We see step function differences at every point.
So are you saying that the artwork that, like there's some famous ones of the bulls, the hunter shooting at the deer?
Yeah, those are done by anatomically modern humans.
Okay, so that's what you're saying. And they're
We
being
don't see that
kind of
for Neanderthals.
attributed. They're just being falsely attributed to Neanderthals.
Well, I don't see anybody claiming that everybody recognizes, no, those are anatomically modern humans.
Okay.
I mean, the earliest date for that kind of art is about 40,000 years ago, and Neanderthals went extinct before that time.
Okay, got you. Okay, that's really interesting. Well, let me broaden out a little bit here. I wanted to ask you this because I know that through your ministry, you come across a lot of different questions, a lot of different people seeking in different parts on their journey, spiritual journey or quest for truth. What are some of the what do you see as some of the biggest questions or obstacles that you've been able to help people with over the course of your career? Because I know you've been at this a long time. I'm curious if you notice a change or a trajectory in the type of questions that you get. And I'm really curious where you feel like, where you sense that you've been able to be effective in addressing people's questions about God.
Well, I've been very active in listening to people's questions and answering them. I mean, that's kind of the core of what we do at Reasons to Believe. And that actually guides our book writing. So the 23 books I've written so far, they're basically addressing these commonly asked questions from skeptics and believers alike. What I've seen recently is that people have been saying, there's no way I can believe the Bible if it teaches this nonsense about a worldwide flood that wiped out all humans, all animals, and transformed all the geology of the earth. So I've just finished a book on Noah's flood, where I basically address all these issues. But for example, some of my posts on social media, I'll get 100,000, 200,000 views. I might get 500 questions being posed towards me. I posted one on Noah's flood, 8 million views, and 7,000 questions. So it basically shows you this is a hot issue, especially in Asia. I mean, most of the responses were coming to me from people living in Asia. And it was in response to a post I made that, hey, the key to interpreting what the Bible says about Noah's flood is what it says about what happens after Noah's flood. Genesis 10 and 11 describe humans after the flood disobeying God's command to fill the earth. They were staying in one place. And so God forcibly scatters humanity. And what we notice in the new scientific measurement, this is all recent, just been published in the last couple of years, that we see that indeed humans were confined to one locale, but very aggressively migrated out of that one locale and began to colonize regions of the world. What's interesting is that the colonization of Northern Europe happened at the same time as Southern Europe, happened at the same time as Western Africa, happened at the same time as the colonization of Japan and Borneo, Australia, Tasmania, New Guinea. It was happening all over the place simultaneously. And we now got multiple independent ways of dating when that happened. The dates fall between 42,000 and 49,000 years ago, which implies that Noah's flood would predate that. And that fits well what you see in Genesis 8, where it says it took a whole year for the water to recede. And for the water to take that long to recede, the water flowing out into the ocean after those 40 days and 40 nights of rain must have been replaced by water from ice and snowfields, which again would put it during the last ice age. And so that would fit the dates that we're getting from this aggressive migration and colonization. It also implies that you don't need the flood to cover the whole planet. And I do believe that Genesis is correct. The flood wiped out all humans and all the animals associated with them, except for those on board the ark. But if you haven't got any humans living on Australia or North or South America or Antarctica, there's no reason for God to flood those areas. There's no evil there. God's intent is to wipe out the ungodliness that's been imposed by people living before the flood. As it says in 2 Peter 2:5, the world of ungodly people was wiped out. And so, given that we're looking at a big flood, but not a global flood, that happened not just 5,000 years ago, but happened previous to 50,000 years ago, there are no scientific barriers to believing what the Bible says in Genesis. You can take it historically, you can take it as being literally true, but part of it too was the fact, was it possible for people living that long ago to build a boat that big? Well, a paper was published literally just a few weeks ago showing that humans were building large sophisticated boats to get from Southeast Asia to Australia. So if they were doing that 40,000 years ago, I don't see any problem with Noah building a boat of that size.
So let me back up a second. So is the sort of layer one objection that you were getting in the comment section of that video that there isn't scientific evidence to support a global flood,
right,
and therefore the biblical account is not true?
That and the fact that people also thought Genesis was teaching that all animal life was wiped out. It in fact says that it's the birds and mammals that are in relationship with human beings that were wiped out. So there's no need for God to kill off all the koalas or all the sloths living in Brazil. They would have had zero contact with humans. Therefore, they weren't damaged by human sin. So that eliminates a major objection. The other objection is there's no way you could have the flood as recent as 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. So that's all based on a misunderstanding of what the Bible actually teaches about Noah's flood. But yeah, what I've been noticing the past few years, that's been the number one reason why people reject the Bible as the inspired and inerrant Word of God. And I wrote this book basically to eliminate that objection.
Okay, so that's really interesting. So in that book, you'll deal with what science is basically looking at, right, and then you'll explain how that is not actually in conflict with the biblical account.
That's exactly what I've done. Yes.
Okay. Are there any other examples of tensions or seeming contradictions that you've resolved in that book that you think would be useful for as way of enticing the listener to take a gander?
Well, I've also got a chapter in the book where I say, okay, people will say this is utter nonsense because it puts Noah too recent. And the question is, okay, if I'm putting Noah during the last ice age, previous to 50,000 years ago, is that defensible in light of the latest genetic research on the origin of human beings? And I basically show that it is, because we would have Noah living somewhere during the last ice age. which would be 50,000 to 120,000 years ago. I actually look at places where the migration of humans would be facilitated and look at those times, because we have evidence that early humans were living in the Persian Gulf area as well as Eastern Africa. Is that actually contradicting what the Bible says? I say no, it isn't. That's permitted. And we have evidence that indeed there were times when it had been very easy for animals and humans to migrate between the Persian Gulf and Eastern Africa. For number one, there was a land bridge joining the Persian Gulf to Eastern Africa during the last ice age. Sea levels were 200 or 300 feet lower than they are today. That resolves a lot of the problems. But I also show that these hypotheses that maybe the flood happened 12,000 years ago, say at the Younger Dryas cooling event, I'm saying no, the floods at that time were not big enough to actually explain what we see in Scripture, and they weren't catastrophic enough to explain what we see in Scripture. And hey, given what we see about the migration of humans, we need a date that's earlier than that.
For someone who would point to something, I'm putting the other shoe on the other foot now. For someone who would look at like the genealogies and see them as a argument against an older view of things, and who might take the view like, hey, you're kind of making compromises. We see the intention here, but you're not invalidating, but you're devaluing the Word of God in some way. How would you go about resolving some of those internal critiques?
Yeah, I actually have that in the book as well, because people have been saying,
cool.
hey, the genealogies force us into a relatively recent date for Adam. And what I find interesting is even the leading organization pushing a recent date, Answers in Genesis, they note that if you start with Adam and use the genealogies to get to Noah, you get a different date than if you start with Abraham and work back to Noah. The two dates differ by about 100 years. So it's like even in their models, there are gaps in the genealogies. Otherwise, you would get the same date both ways. You don't. But if you look at people who are fluent in biblical Hebrew, they point things out. Notice that the Hebrew word for father, ab, equivalently means grandfather, great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather. Same thing with the Hebrew word for son, ben. It can mean grandson, great-grandson, great-great-grandson. So there's a lot more flexibility in biblical Hebrew than there is in English. And also, if you compare the different biblical genealogies, you notice all of them have gaps. For example, you look at Luke 3, which gives the genealogy from Adam to Noah. You have 11 names instead of the 10 names you see in Genesis 5. So even that is evidence that, you do have missing generations. And I argue that every biblical genealogy is basically selecting individuals in the actual genealogy to be mentioned and is dropping others not to be mentioned. And I think in each case, the Bible is making a theological point. So, for example, there are genealogies that will drop the mention of men and insert the mention of women, basically making the point the gospel's for men and women. Other genealogies will drop, say, the Jews and insert the names of Gentiles, saying the gospel is for not only Jews, but Gentiles. And also notice that sometimes the genealogies will drop an individual who's been engaged in really horrific sin. I mean, you see that often the name Dan is dropped from genealogies because the tribe of Dan, as you can read in the book of Judges, really degraded to an unbelievable level. Other places, however, it will mention, Rahab the harlot, basically saying if you've engaged in sin but repent of your sin, you can be part of the family of God. So Tamar, who seduced her father and had a child by her, father-in-law, she's in the genealogy, even though she committed a fairly gross sin. It's like, hey, all sinners, if they repent, there's a pathway for salvation. So I think that's the larger point of the genealogies. And the fact is, if you can contrast certain genealogies, you can see that up to 90% of the names have been dropped. So it's like that allows for a much earlier date for Noah than if you assume there's no gaps in the genealogies.
That is really interesting. Can I pivot? This is going to be a hard pivot, but I'm looking at the clock and I see we only have about 10 minutes left. And I had meant to ask you something more. This has all been so good, by the way. I'm loving the conversation. And I normally try to do a more smooth transition, but I got to ask you, since you are in fact an astrophysicist, something more related to that topic. And so we're going out of Genesis now. And if we have just 10 minutes to
Sure.
tackle, I wanted to ask about if there's anything that you're aware of from the James Webb Space Telescope recently. I know it's constantly, I follow on Instagram and different things, and it's constantly collecting data. And I wanted to ask if there's anything that is, whether from the James Webb Telescope specifically or anything else that's sort of new, recent, that you think is noteworthy or of interest. And the reason I bring this up is because a few years ago, I remember when some of those findings first came out, there was that publication that was like, the James Webb Space Telescope is debunking the Big Bang Theory, and it's showing that everything is a hoax. And then I saw a lot of people kind of going a little bit deeper into that and going, actually, wait, no, that's not really the point there at all. And so it kind of just opened my mind up to how people will kind of find a narrative angle in something. Like they'll take the data and they'll kind of like angle it in a certain direction. And so anyways, I just wanted to kind of open-endedly ask you things like that that are recent scientific discoveries, and where are you seeing things pointing, or I don't know, just anything noteworthy along those lines.
Well, it's interesting. I just was writing an article on that literally a couple of hours before we got into this show. So
Oh, cool.
I'm staying up to date on this, but I think you frame it right. A lot of people see these announcements from the James Webb Space Telescope. We're finding things we didn't expect to find, and therefore they conclude the Big Bang creation model is in trouble. Well, if you actually read those papers, what they're saying is our previous understandings of how stars form and how galaxies form, we're going to need to adjust that. None of these papers are saying that we're seeing something the Big Bang that calls the Big Bang model into question. None of these papers are saying that. I think lay people need to realize there's a family of Big Bang creation models. And we knew that before the James Webb Space Telescope went up. Its mission was to tell us which of these different Big Bang creation models is actually the correct description of the origin and history of the universe. And what's coming out from the James Webb Space Telescope is that, today the largest star that can form is about 100 times the mass of our star, the sun. But we astronomers knew if the universe begins as Big Bang cosmology states, with only hydrogen and helium and a trace amount of lithium, you can actually have much more massive stars form. I mean, once you get oxygen and carbon and nitrogen, that limits how big the star can be. But that limitation would be removed in the very early history of the universe according to Big Bang cosmology. That's a core prediction of the Big Bang. And so what we're now discovering is that we're finding evidence that indeed galaxies are forming earlier than what we would expect if there weren't these really massive stars forming early. And we're getting supermassive black holes in some of these early galaxies that are literally 1 billion times the mass of our star, the sun. That can only happen if the first stars that form, some of them are many hundreds of times the mass of our star, the sun, maybe even thousands of times the mass of our star, the sun. The more massive the star, the faster it will burn up and explode and distribute the ashes of its nuclear burning to form a new generation of stars. And so just a few days ago, a paper was published saying the most distant galaxy yet discovered, we see what looks like dust in the continuum radiation of the spectrum, and we see what looks like an oxygen emission line, which means that, and this galaxy is existing only 300 million years after the Big Bang creation event. And not all big models would predict that you could get those heavy elements that early in the history of the universe, but we know it's possible if indeed the firstborn stars are coming in at, say, 1,000 times the mass of our star, the sun. because they literally will burn up in less than 1 million years and explode their ashes. And so you still got 100 million years for those ashes to be accumulated within that star. You got lots of time. And if you got stars that are thousands of times the mass of our star, the sun, they're going to become black holes. The black holes will merge, and you quickly get supermassive black holes. Now, if you want to watch a video on this, we did a workshop this past July. What did the James Webb Space Telescope discover about the Big Bang? And we invited world-renowned astronomers who actually use the James Webb Space Telescope to participate in this workshop. Bottom line, we all agreed James Webb is making a stronger case for the Big Bang, not a weaker case, and now is showing us which of these different Big Bang models is actually the correct Big Bang model. So you can go to Reasons to Believe YouTube, and you will see a talk I gave, what does the James Webb Space Telescope say about the early history of the universe and about the Big Bang.
And within those different families that you're describing, or those different options that were being looked at as hypotheses, what direction then are things pointing now in light of some of these recent findings?
Well, it'll be a while because we have to have statistics. I mean,
Okay.
the galaxies that are showing up really early with lots of light and huge supermassive black holes, they're the easiest ones to see. And so we need to let the James Webb take a lot more data to actually get the population statistics. It may turn out that only a few galaxies form that early and that aggressively, and the vast majority take more time. We don't know that yet. That'd be something that James Webb still needs to nail down. But we now know beyond any shadow of doubt that the first stars that formed were much, much bigger than the biggest stars that can form today, which is a major prediction of Big Bang cosmology. So it's one of the things the Big Bang has actually been successful with the James Webb. To me, the most exciting thing, we found a distant galaxy that had a halo of gas outside that galaxy. But the bright stars in the galaxy illuminated that halo of gas sufficiently, they were able to determine that halo of gas only has hydrogen and helium in it, which is exactly what the Big Bang predicted, that the early universe would only have hydrogen, helium, and a trace amount of lithium. For the first time, we actually found an object in the universe that doesn't have any oxygen, carbon, or nitrogen, or iron. It only has hydrogen and helium. So that was a huge success for the Big Bang.
And how recent was that discovery?
That discovery was made less than a year ago. It's a discovery. That video I talked about that's on our YouTube channel, I go into that discovery.
Okay, tell me if there's anything I should add on top of this in terms of significance, because I'm sure there is more than just this, but I want to just highlight that the significance of this is that the Big Bang model shows us the universe expanding from a certain point in the past, which aligns with a biblical depiction of.
Well, keep in mind the Bible
cause.
was the first book to actually speak about the expansion of the universe, the stretching out of the heavens. 11 times that's stated in the Bible by 6 different authors. And it's not just hindsight. Jewish theologians living 800 years ago, they read these biblical texts and came to the same conclusion. According to the Bible, we live in an expanding universe. Now we have the observations to prove that beyond a shadow of doubt. We also have the theory that tells us life is only possible if we live in an expanding universe. But I think what's most exciting about these new discoveries is that you need big stars forming early in order to get the abundance of heavy elements we need 14 billion years later for human civilization to be at a high technology level. So that to me is what I think is really exciting about these discoveries. It's basically showing how God was engineering the early history of the universe with human beings 13 billion years later in mind, making sure they have exactly the right resources they need. Because it's the stars and the black holes are the ones that make the heavy elements we need for human life to be possible and human technology to be possible.
So you're literally talking about like the periodic table of elements.
Yes, yes.
That would not exist if not for things playing out as they have with stars and black holes.
Well, what's interesting about planet Earth is that we have, these 92 elements, but they all exist at abundance levels that are optimal for human life and human civilization. And all but 2 of those elements are highly anomalous compared to what we'd expect to find on other rocky planets. So, for example, we have 60 times less sulfur than Mars has. And if that wasn't the case, we wouldn't be able to grow the food that we grow on the surface of the Earth. And you look at the elements in our body, the molybdenum, it exists at an anomalous level. Have you got too much molybdenum in your body, you will die. Too little, you will die. And yet that abundance level is highly anomalous here on planet Earth. Same thing for phosphorus. We have a hyperabundance of phosphorus on the Earth. And clearly that's one of the essential elements we need. What is the astrophysical history you need to get these elements on a future planet Earth where every element is at the optimal abundance level to make humans and human civilization possible?
Wow. My last question is there something in your area of expertise that is like natural selection that is used as a way of explaining those anomalies? You know how within biology it's like, well, natural selection is what allows those traits or those, anomalous things to go forward. Is there anything like that in astrophysics or in astronomy?
Well, I actually spoke on that just a couple of days ago at a public meeting, basically making the point that when you look at the naturalistic explanation for the history of life, they say what drove the changes we see in the fossil record: natural selection, mutations, gene exchange, and epigenetics. Those are the 4 mechanisms. There's some speculation there might be a 5th mechanism, but papers have been published saying if there is a 5th, the level of its contribution to the history of life is below 0.01%. We really do have the 4 that make everything happen. However, what we notice, if those are the 4 that are making things happen, you'd expect from a naturalistic perspective that you will have a differentiation or diversification of species happening because of these 4 mechanisms, where if you wait long enough, you'll actually get a new genus. And if you wait even longer, the differentiation of genera will produce a new family. A family will produce a new order. An order will produce a new class. And last of all, you're going to get a new phylum. The problem is, when we look at the fossil record, we see the opposite of what these naturalistic models would predict. So if you go to the Avalon and Cambrian explosions of life, the phyla show up first. The species show up later. So the diversification of species happens last. The diversification of phyla happened first. A phylum refers to a basic body plan. So, for example, all vertebrates are part of the chordate phylum. In fact, a lot of non-vertebrates, any animal with a long neural cord would be a chordate. Those chordates show up at the beginning of the Cambrian, not at the end. So the most complex phylum shows up at the beginning of the Cambrian. In fact, 50 phyla show up at the beginning of the Cambrian event. They show up simultaneously. Moreover, what I think is really astounding, they show up at the very moment that oxygen jumps from 8% to 10%. These animals can't exist with only 8% oxygen in the atmosphere. They can with 10. And the fossil record tells us there is a sudden jump from 8 to 10. The moment it hits 10, all these phyla show up. And then they begin to produce new classes, new orders, new families, new genera, and then finally a species. It's literally the exact opposite of what you'd expect from a naturalistic perspective. And what I find very encouraging, The scientific literature is filled with papers written by non-theistic paleontologists that are saying the more we study the Cambrian event, the more challenging it is to try to defend it from a naturalistic perspective. The more we learn, the more impossible it looks like there's a naturalistic explanation.
I'm really happy that you interpreted that question the way that you did, because I really loved all the information that you just shared. But what I was actually trying to ask, and maybe it's a stupid question, is, so you brought up those four mechanisms within the explanation of how biological life, moves forward. And what I was trying to ask is, in the area of cosmology or astronomy, are there some other mechanisms like those four that people point to in order to naturalistically explain how you have all of these elements, how you have all these things finely tuned, how you explain it? Because my understanding, which is very rudimentary, on the biological front is basically you get a bunch of at-bats and it's like a bunch of death, and life going forward. And I know that's a really dumbed down explanation, but it's basically trial and error, survival of the fittest, and mutation, and eventually you get complexity, and eventually you get the world that we have today. But what I'm trying to ask is, when I think about the universe, I don't understand that you have that same amount of iterations. Or does the question make any sense?
Yeah. When you bring the cosmology in, you have a far more potent argument that it has to be supernatural intervention.
Okay.
Because these naturalists are assuming that the cosmology is constant. It's not. The sun gets brighter and brighter as it continues to fuse hydrogen to helium in its nuclear furnace. And we see in the history of life is that we have these mass extinction events where millions of species suddenly are removed from the Earth, typically as a result of a giant asteroid colliding with the Earth and wiping out all these species. But these mass extinction events are followed by mass speciation events. And what's interesting is that in order to compensate for the brightening of the sun, you need life on Earth that is progressively more efficient in removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So as the sun gets brighter and brighter, our atmosphere becomes progressively less and less efficient in its capacity to trap heat from the sun. But only a mind that knows the future physics of the sun would know which life to remove from planet Earth and which new life to create to have just the right increase in removal of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to ensure that the temperature on the surface of the Earth remains optimal for life. A naturalistic mechanism is not going to know the future physics of the sun, or it's going to make a wild guess and get the guess wrong. And also, you need these mass extinction events to happen at a particular periodicity, roughly about every 30 to 35 million years. You need a mass extinction event, and you need to be quickly followed by a mass speciation event. From a naturalistic perspective, how is it possible that natural selection, mutations, gene exchange, and epigenetics would explain millions of new species, radically different from the ones that went extinct, suddenly appearing after a mass extinction event? But that's what happens. And you actually see it in Psalm 104. It says it's the property of all life to die off, but God recreates and renews the face of the earth, and does so about every 30 to 35 million years. And it's like, again, from a naturalistic perspective, how do you explain that regular periodicity, and how do you explain that it happens at a tempo that's exactly what you need to compensate for the brightening of the sun?
Wow. That's really cool. I could literally keep going for hours, but I want to respect your time. Thank you so much again for coming on the program, Dr. Ross. And if people want to get more of you, where can they go?
They can go to reasons.org, or they can go to the reasons.org YouTube channel. They'll see literally thousands of videos that they can watch. You can actually Google some debates I've done. One of the most fun ones is with the British Oxford chemist, Peter Atkins. Put Peter Atkins, Hugh Ross in, it'll pop right up. A lot of humor in that debate, but also a lot of really good philosophy and science.
That was a fantastic debate. Also, I don't know if you, I think I might have heard you talking a little bit beforehand about my new project that I want to launch of inviting people to do like a Q&A with you guys, with the experts. So we can talk about that when we cut the recording, but in case that's even possible, I want to tease that
Definitely.
concept.
You already invited me to do a Q&A with a group that you have organized. That was a
Yes.
lot of fun. So yeah, call up on me whenever you want to do that again.
Okay,
great. Yeah.
I want to invite the folks here on YouTube to pick your brain as well, and
That'd be great.
get more people participating, because I know that out of a conversation like this, there must be a lot of questions teeming, and so I want to give those who are interested the chance to dialogue in that way with you.
You know, that's a great idea, because I see the postings of these shows that I do with you, and some of them generate a lot of comments and questions. And sometimes I did dive into that and try to answer a few, but it's really challenging. So organizing a show where it's just like this, and let people ask their hard questions, and you can get a lot done in an hour.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So we'll make it happen.
Sounds great.
Thank you so much, Dr.
All
Ross.
right. Very welcome. Very enjoyable.
If you enjoyed this conversation, you might also enjoy the Wisdom Society. Join today, support this channel, invest in yourself, grow in faith, connect with believers from around the world. Click the link in the description to find out more.